Movie games suck. Most of them do, anyway. See, there was a solid period of about 25 years where video game adaptations became as essential for big movie releases as a soundtrack CD or a novelization. And though every once in a while a handful of them was able to cut through the noise and overcome tight budgets and even tighter deadlines to become high quality products, especially those based on Peter Jackson movies for some reason, for the most part those same limitations have brought us everything from worst games of all time contenders, to forgettable shovelware, to interesting oddities left behind in the winds of time. Those last ones are the ones that I want to focus on today. Not the big releases from franchises too big to go by the wayside, your James Bonds, Jurassic Parks, or Star Wars. Some of these games are based on movies that would go on to be big, memorable franchises that still hold a special place in a lot of people's hearts. Others on franchise hopefuls that crashed and burned, never quite finding a foothold with audiences or critics. And besides being movie adaptations, they have in common that I either had them as a child, played them, or at the very least wanted to play them at the time, which personally makes going back to them more interesting. As a caveat, I must admit that I did not finish most of these games, which might be grounds for video game YouTuber jail. So if that's something that bothers you, it's okay for you to close this video, just make sure you like and subscribe on the way out. Now that the plug is out of the way, this did open the door to a fun challenge. Will any of these games be engaging enough for me to see them through to the end? I guess it's time to find out. I'm Anubing and these are the Forgotten Movie Games. I didn't grow up in the 80s, so for me Indiana Jones is just a guy in that one great Spielberg film and a couple of decent ones. If you were anything like me, your true adventure film icon had a completely different name. Rick O'Connor. Whoa! Oh yeah. As a child who was just the right age when The Mummy came out, Brendan Fraser absolutely captured my imagination. Who would have thought that George of the Jungle could be this cool without ever losing that silly edge? And the movie itself, with memorable characters, action-packed sequences, exotic locations, and a charismatic cast, was just a grand slam. And truthfully, it still is. Unlike most action blockbusters of its era, it has aged like fine wine.
What was that?
It came from over there.
The video game adaptation was released a year after the movie, in November of 2000, for the PC, PS1, and Game Boy Color, the PS1 version being the one that I owned. The game sees players take control of Rick, in what is essentially a bad Tomb Raider ripoff, which is to say a third-person shooter/platformer hybrid with a big focus on puzzle solving and dual-hand shooting. And this makes all the sense in the world, since much like the movie, Tomb Raider draws heavy inspiration from the Indiana Jones franchise. The big noticeable difference here are the controls. They are not exactly tank controls, but they are not even slightly as fluid as they should be. They are in fact very stiff, which makes moving in any direction, and especially jumping, a challenge unto itself. Thankfully, jumping is not necessarily a big part of the gameplay, unless you are going for every collectible, of which there are many. You start off in a hub world similar to how one would in a Mario platformer, with many doors that lead you to different levels once you meet the requirements to open each one. This hub world is populated by a handful of characters from the movie, all of whom sound and look decently enough like their film counterparts, with the exception of the main character himself, whose voice actor sounds more like Taram Killen's impression of Brad Pitt on SNL than Brendan Fraser.
Stay here, I'll go check it out.
I want to make sure to lather on that SPF, protect the skin.
This is not a complaint though, as this, alongside the silly walking animation, adds a hilariously unexpected flair to the proceedings. Each of the levels is made up by 6 different arenas where the point is to defeat the enemies or solve a fairly easy puzzle to receive a key to progress to the next one. That's pretty much as complex as it gets in terms of the gameplay loop. Reach an area, shoot everyone, maybe flip a switch on the wall, get the key, move on to the next area. Rinse and repeat until the level is complete. And having to do it 6 times for each makes everything feel unnecessarily slow. Thankfully, there is a good variety of weapons at your disposal, from the mystical to the more earthly, and several different types of enemies to keep at least a decent sense of discovery to the proceedings. Unfortunately, the controls don't allow for much enjoyment, as the enemies mindlessly walk towards you and you need to be perfectly aligned to them in order for the auto lock to work, The sluggish movement means you'll take a solid couple of hits by the time the bullet reaches its intended target. It's a pain and one of the biggest frustrations the game has to offer. But it's not the biggest one, not by a long shot. Every once in a while the game tries to break up the action by throwing some levels that change the style of gameplay. These are by far the worst thing this game has to offer. While the regular levels are sluggish and difficult to get accustomed to, once you do, there's definitely some enjoyment to be had, especially when it sucks you in with the creepy atmosphere. But these levels can't be called anything but dreadful. In one of them, you have to navigate an underground river while on top of a log, trying to avoid different obstacles along the way. The movement is even slower than usual, and the limited draw distance means every movement and every jump needs to be precise to an absurd degree. This was the first huge test of patience I found. Just an annoying sequence I had to repeat over and over again to reach the next level. Another one of these happens at the end of the next level, as Rick is chasing one of the mummy's minions in a side-scroller level that throws fire, obstacles and rolling boulders at you. The movement is considerably worse than in the rest of the game. Jumping, for example, happens about a second and change after you press the button, and you don't see what's coming at you until the last possible second. It becomes a trial and error sequence that's very easy to mess up. There's no fun to be had here. I was frustrated enough by the second one of these that I was pretty much done with the game, but the quality of the presentation kept my curiosity piqued long enough to keep at it. It is not strictly based on the movie's narrative, as the entire adventure is confined to the pyramids, but each level does a stellar job matching the general vibe of the movie, with the lightning by torchlight, walls filled with ancient Egyptian art, sand-based traps and puzzles, and truly unique sound effects that match the general aesthetic to a T. The music also does a lot to elevate the presentation, as the exceptional score is taken directly from the film. It is so goddamn good that sometimes the difference in quality between music and graphics does not compute entirely, and can have the opposite effect of pulling you out of the experience. Like, a few times I couldn't help but think, wait, this is too good for this game. And again, there's fun to be had in the regular levels, despite being generally unfairly hard and clunky, but by the time the second log level rears its ugly head, and then a segment that is basically Temple Run but infinitely worse, I was like, life's too short man, I'm done here. I felt I had experienced enough and there would not be any satisfaction or sense of accomplishment from reaching the end of the game. This is all purely based on that handful of extra segments. I don't know if they were an afterthought, but they feel unfinished and sadly drag down the entire rest of the game with them. It is a shame, really. I think this game is certainly a step above a lot of shovelware, but I can't wholly recommend it. To fans of the movie, it might make a good curiosity. But anyone who wants to play a retro action adventure game in a similar vein might be better served by going back to the classic Tomb Raiders. Maybe someday when I'm old and retired and have more time and patience, I'll go back and finish it. But for now, let's look at our next game. I think using the word disaster when talking about media is rather extreme. Movies, music, books, they can be bad, appalling, awful. But disaster is a word that should be saved for stuff that is truly earth-shatteringly abysmal. And very few pieces of media are as deserving of that word as the Planet of the Apes remake by Tim Burton and its video game adaptation. An adaptation might be used loosely here. This game definitely tried to ride the coattails of that movie's release, but it's not really based on it. I remember seeing it all the time at the video game store I frequented, right next to a giant cardboard display for the movie. But for one reason or another I never picked it up. Still, its existence always intrigued me. And despite being chronically online since I was like 9, I never watched so much as a screenshot of the gameplay. It remained a total mystery until recently. Too bad it didn't stay that way. Planet of the Apes for the PS1 is a survival adventure game that is equal parts a Resident Evil clone as it is a Metal Gear Solid one. Just devoid of any creativity, atmosphere, quality, fun, basically anything that made those games even slightly good. Despite sharing the name, cover aesthetic, and release year with the Burton movie, Planet of the Apes is in fact based on the original 1963 novel, with elements of the classic 1969 film starring Charlton Heston and the Burton film splashed here and there.
Shh. Ulysses. Romulus. Look.
They look like...
What's that?
After an impossibly long intro that sheds light on the ugly character models and boring voice acting that lacks any charisma or personality, the game starts off with the protagonist locked in a jail cell by the ape overlords. And the second it gives you control, it is undeniable that this is going to be a dreadful experience. Starting with the fact that this has proper awful tank controls. At a time when the plethora of Resident Evil sequels had already perfected them, this feels genuinely archaic, which makes it all the more dreary to navigate the expansive levels. In any other game, having levels as big and explorable as this would be a positive, especially coming off of the mummy's claustrophobic rooms and hallways. But the awful controls in combination with the nondescript brown and grey environments and the cryptic nature of the objectives and goals makes everything drag on for far too long. Seriously, figuring out what to do without using a guide or following another playthrough is a task for a smarter, more patient person than me. At one point in the beginning, while trying to figure out what to do, I even pressed a button on the wall that turned out to be the alarm that alerted the apes of my presence. And this was before I had figured out the combat controls or got any weapons to defend myself with. Not that there's too much to figure out in that instance. Combat devolves into pushing a button to punch the handful of apes that populate each level. The hit detection of these punches is questionable at best, non-existent at worst, and each ape takes about 100 to be defeated. That is, if you don't take the 3 or so hits that takes to kill you. And it doesn't get any better once you get a melee weapon, as it still takes a good chunk of time to make them fall. Guns don't fare too much better, but they have the added extra of just being awful to aim. There's also the ability to block by pushing down on the D-pad twice, which the character does after taking a step back, and that usually ends up with you either falling or getting stuck between enemies. Speaking of enemies, they take different shapes and sizes, and their combat style changes depending on the breed of ape. A nice touch, even if ultimately the same tactics are used against all of them. Though for some reason it also throws giant rats at you that cannot be blocked and are harder to kill due to an extra slow kicking animation. The Metal Gear Solid of it all comes in the form of stealth mechanics that can be used to avoid unnecessary enemies or knock them out without taking a hit and having them alert their bodies close by, or sound the alarm. That is, whenever I'm not doing it for them. But oh boy. If the movement is slow and clunky before, crouching into stealth mode makes everything slow to a halt. And there aren't any unique animations to make stealth takedowns any more visceral than a regular fight. It's mostly just useful to buy you some time to find health before getting whacked in a fight. This mode also activates a radar that in theory allows you to check on enemy positions, but for the life of me, I don't think I was ever able to figure out how to get any use out of it. Like in The Mummy, the point of each level is reduced to solving a handful of puzzles and beating the enemies to proceed to the next area. But here, the puzzles are harder to solve. Not in a satisfying way, mind you. Like I said, there's a lot of running around trying to figure out where to find the key that would lead you to the next area. At least there's a good enough variety in the environments in the first half of the game, despite the graphics being absolutely disgusting. Between the primitive jail, futuristic labs, underground railroad, a mining complex, and even an ape university, there's certain ambition in the sheer amount of locations they try to take you through. The highlight of this is a Gothic cathedral that is filled with religious imagery that feels more out of a classic vampire movie than a Planet of the Apes one. Yet somehow it fits. I'm not sure if this is taken out of the book, but it is one of the few interesting things in the game. As is the story, or at least as much as I could gather from it. The cutscenes are so poorly acted it is impossible to follow through entirely. But it tells the tale of an ape civil war that the humans are trying to take advantage of in order to rise and become free again.
We'll have to use every resource available to stop them, even if it means war.
If anything, it at least made me curious to read the original book, which I've never done. At least there is that to take away. There's clearly some level of ambition at display. Between the story, the settings, and set pieces such as the area where you have to control the character from the point of view of an ape sniper trying to shoot you off the ledge of a building, there are a few positive takeaways, but everything is so incompetently put together that it never quite reaches what it's aiming for. There are too many technical issues. The controls lead to unnecessary and exasperating deaths, and it's just awful, presentation-wise. This might be a top 5 worst games I've ever played in my life. An unmitigated disaster if there ever was one in video games. To what point this is incompetence from the developer's side is hard to tell. This game came out in 2001, being first greenlit in 1998 when James Cameron was supposed to direct the movie. But then, it was delayed when that version of the movie went into development hell. That must have resulted in several changes in production, so that might be at fault here. Too much time without a clear idea of where to proceed can be just as bad for any creative endeavor as not having enough time or money. Still, a game like this is better left in obscurity where it belongs. On the subject of gargantuan failures, let's move on to 2004's big-budget Disney movie, Around the World in 80 Days. More of a remake of the classic 1956 film than a straight-up adaptation of Jules Verne's legendary novel, it stars Jackie Chan, who by this point was already an unmatched legend in Hong Kong films and had broken through in America with the Rush Hour and Shanghai Noon movies, but still didn't have a massive blockbuster hit to catapult him to the same level of stardom as, say, Harrison Ford or Tom Cruise. With Disney's backing, this movie was supposed to be Jackie Chan's big entrance into that realm, and then it came out and became not just a critical and commercial failure, but one of the biggest box office bombs of all time, and one of Disney's worst performing movies ever. Despite that, I still have a soft spot for this one. I watched it more times than I care to admit on DVD, and I still think it's very fun. Having seen it recently, it's just a fun, entertaining romp that plays to the strengths of its cast and doesn't overstay its welcome. It's not The Mummy, but it certainly isn't Tim Burton's Planet of the Apes either. That level of enjoyment wasn't reached on the video game adaptation. This side-scrolling action platformer developed by Sapphire, the same developers of the underrated James Bond 007 game for the original Game Boy, which we previously discussed on the channel, this was released on the Game Boy Advance with a mobile version developed by Pick Up and Play. Let's get this out of the way quickly. It's clear that this game had a budget of about 2 bananas and a Pepsi. It is ugly. Though the use of Donkey Kong Country style digitized sprite renderings feels like an inspired idea when it comes to trying to capture Jackie Chan's patented mix of Bruce Lee meets Buster Keaton movements. There are zero details to the models, and they all look blurry and unfinished, which negates the admittedly fluid animation of the movements. Around the World shares a pattern of simplicity with the previous 2 games. Each level requires you, taking the role of Jackie Chan's character from the movie, Passport 2, whatever, to traverse the environments in order to find 4 keys that will grant you access to the next level. There is, of course, a bigger focus on hand-to-hand combat than in the others. And while I mentioned that there's a lot of fluidity in the animations of the attacks, gameplay-wise there's little variety in Jackie's arsenal of moves. Only less than a handful of punches and kicks that can't be connected into combos, and the hit detection is also non-existent. Each level follows a location from the movie, from London to Paris to Istanbul and India, so there's some visual variety to at least give it some freshness every once in a while. But what you'll be doing is essentially the same. Even the movie's climactic balloon fight scene has been reduced to some wobbly platforming while fighting a handful of baddies. And while each level has a couple of places to showcase Chan's signature acrobatics, in general, there's nothing to do more than jump into a place, punching someone, grabbing a key, moving on. There are no secrets to find, no collectibles, no special character interactions, no extra gameplay mechanics or minigames to spice things up. I'd say this level of simplicity could be expected from a licensed game released on a portable console, but then I look at the depth this same developer managed to reach with its James Bond title on lesser hardware no less, and I can't help but feel disappointed. Maybe that's on me for expecting something out of a game based on freaking Around the World in 80 days. It is the very definition of a cash grab, a playable but monotonous slog that feels like the alpha version of a real game, and features some of the worst sound effects I've ever heard in any video game. Next time I'm itching to play a Jackie Chan game, I'll just put Stunt Master on the PlayStation. In this bonus round, I'll quickly mention some of the games that I tried for this video, that even though they didn't hook me enough to do in-depth analysis, I still found reasonably interesting to talk about. Would you believe me if I told you that Alien Trilogy is the first Alien game I played, and to this day it's still the only one? Shame on me, right? It was interesting to come back to this because way back then I never made it past the first few enemies. I wasn't as well versed on the dynamics of Doom and its clones as I am right now, and believe me, this is a Doom clone through and through. You are thrown immediately into the action, playing the role of Ridley and recreating scenes from the first 3 movies. Albeit, in a more video gamey fashion, with enemies coming at you from everywhere, very much like, Doom. I have 3 big issues with this game. First one being that in following the action-packed nature of the Doom formula, it never effectively creates the same level of tension and dread the best Alien movies do. Secondly, there's no build-up to any of the creatures. Chestbusters, facehuggers, and xenomorphs showed up out of nowhere within minutes of starting, and their AI is atrocious. They are never as scary as they should feel. Finally, this game is freaking hard. I invariably became surrounded over and over again, and the gameplay devolved into me walking backwards while trying to shoot surrounding enemies, until inevitably reaching a wall and getting mauled to death. At least I got killed so many times that I got to see all the different variations of the death animation. There's one for each type of enemy that kills you, and they are by far the coolest thing about the game. But for as much as I enjoyed these animations, I eventually found out that the most enjoyable way to play this for me was to activate the God Mode cheat code, with infinite health and ammo, and plow through every enemy. It's definitely an interesting game, sadly not for me.
Hey look, Tulio! That's us!
Oh no.
Road to El Dorado, or actually Golden Glory, Road to El Dorado for some reason, is a game based on one of my favorite animated movies. Weirdly, I remember this one being a 3D platformer. Maybe I'm confusing it with another game from my childhood. So I came back to it to find out it's actually an adventure game in the vein of the Monkey Island series, which is very obviously trying to ape, except it lacks the creativity, world building and quality puzzles of better games in the genre. And, to top it all off, it's so slow and buggy it's barely playable. And look, this is not an emulation problem. Reviews at the time also found it to be a buggy mess, and it was downright buried by reviewers. Admittedly, I didn't get too far into it, but it's such an atrocious technical release that it goes back full circle to me kind of admiring the absolute guts to release something so broken. It's interesting to talk about, less so to play. If I ever want to play an adventure game with a fun tropical theme, I'll just go back to Zack and Wiki. By the way, Mr. Capcom, sir, if you're seeing this, please remaster Zack and Wiki for the Switch. I desperately need this. In my research, I did find that the Game Boy Color version of this is a much better game. More of a typical side-scrolling platformer. Maybe I'll check it out sometime. This is the game that made me most happy to replay for this video. Not because it's good, god no. It's a beat 'em up with no sense of impact, and a lot of it basically plays itself, with no input from the player on any of the special abilities. The movement is floaty and it just doesn't feel good. Gameplay wise, it's a mess. I was just so happy to rediscover that this is every bit as insane as I remember. It is an absolutely visually and sonically unhinged video game. Programmed and developed under what I can only imagine is the strongest ayahuasca found in the depths of the Peruvian Amazon. Not a damn thing about this makes sense. It takes Schumacher's aesthetics from the movie and adds an overlay of Andy Warhol infused arrangement. At one point, Batman goes Super Saiyan, just because. That should tell you everything you need to know. It is a fascinating piece of shit, beautiful, impeccable, and I don't want to play it ever again in my life. When it comes to comic book movies from the 90s, with the possible exception of Batman Returns, I don't think anyone comes close to Blade. Marvel's R-rated Vampire Saga perfectly captures a moment in time, when CGI could be equal parts awful and engaging, when Wesley Snipes wearing a black trench coat and sunglasses at night was the single most badass image ever produced by mankind, and when you could say lines like
"Some motherfuckers are always trying to ice skate uphill,"
and be taken 100% seriously. For my money, it's still the best R-rated superhero movie ever made. The video game adaptation came out 2 years later, at the turn of the millennium, and it's only tangentially related to its big screen counterpart. My memories of this were fuzzy. I remember playing it once or twice, but not having any recollection of the game beyond the first level. And that tracks, because this does make a hell of a first impression. The soundtrack kicks in immediately, and one of the first images you see is the decent looking Wesley Snipes model, casually hanging off of a helicopter. Unfortunately, he is not dropped into the iconic vampire ray from the movie, which is the first indication that this game follows its own side story separate from the film. We start off in the first of many, and I mean many, warehouses that belong to some vampire bad guy or another, who is transporting some sort of ancient entity hell-bent on destroying the world. I think. Honestly, I zoned out for most of the story. It's glacially told through static cutscenes in between levels, and it's not particularly engaging. Anyway, we infiltrate this warehouse with the help of Blaze's trusty old man psychic Whistler, who every once in a while pops up via radio to give us hints and, to my absolute delight, become playable later on. But first, we play as the half-human, half-vampire vampire hunter. The game is played from a third-person perspective, similarly to EA's Tomorrow Never Dies, which we've also talked about on this channel before, except this one's a little slower, but there is more enemy variety, some of which demands a focus on melee combat. This means there is no one-size-fits-all strategy to going through the levels, and you have to select from a variety of weapons that include pistols, machine guns, grenade launchers, and more, each of which has 3 types of ammo that affects enemy differently. Silver bullets inflict more damage against vampires than they do zombies, for example. Then there's the katana, which works great against some enemies who prefer hand-to-hand combat, but not so much against the ones with a focus on projectiles. This system is accompanied by a lock-on that, when held for enough time, fills a gauge. Timing its release correctly leads to critical hits that inflict greater damage, or in some cases lead to an instant kill. All of this means there's quite a bit of tactical thought to be put into each encounter. Ammo for certain weapons is limited, so much like, say, Resident Evil, you have to be very mindful of when you use each weapon, and try to get as many of those critical hits as possible to save ammo. While it's fun and sets the game apart from other games of its type, certainly from the similarly third-person focused The Mummy and Planet of the Apes games, this system can become quite tiresome as you progress. It effectively means that you can't really shoot or button mash your way out of a level, even if you're feeling burned out. For me, it meant taking extended breaks from the game, because again, I was having fun, but repetitiveness sets in fairly quickly. That's also in part to the fact that the weapon system is about as much variety as you'll get here. There's some platforming sprinkled here and there, but as usual in most PS1 games, it's not fun to pull off, and the camera does not help in the slightest. Speaking of camera, while most of the game is played from a behind-the-back third-person perspective, there are more than a few instances that demand you play from a fixed camera angle, that change the control directions depending on where you're standing. One of the boss fights is even played from this perspective. Alongside the difficulty and a lack of conveniently placed checkpoints, this is easily the most frustrating part of the game. Very few levels have any flair, and you're mostly contained to warehouses and underground labs. It also loses steam near the end. But I can't deny it. It hooked me like no other game I played for this video. That is another similarity it shares with Tomorrow Never Dies. If you saw that video, you know that there's an arcade style fun that I had with that one. Same thing happens here. It's a lot of fun to blast the heads off of vampires and watch the blood flow in all its gory glory. The combat is effectively punchy, and the production quality, from the graphics to the voiceovers to the music, while not mind-blowing by any means, effectively captures the essence of the movie. There's even a level late in the game where you play as Whistler, which doesn't add much variety except that he's a bit bulkier than Blade and can't jump. But it is just plain cool that the developers care enough to add one of the more often forgotten sidekicks in Marvel movies. It is a flawed but fun adventure that kept me engaged enough to actually see it through the end, which is an awful lot more than I can say for the rest of the games in this video. Blade is the kind of game that just simply doesn't exist anymore. The solid licensed 6 out of 10 that doesn't demand you invest dozens of hours to get some fun out of it. And it's a good companion to whatever movie it is based on. I wish we had more of this being made, just not at $70 please. And that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching through the end if you did. Let me know what you think. Did you play any of these games? Are there any other in a similar vein that you would recommend? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.